What's up, riders? My name's Chewy, and today we're going to be reviewing the brand new Zerode Katipo. Let's check it out.
All right, now first things first, I know you're all wondering, Chewy, what is that fork on the front of your bike? Now that is a linkage fork from a company called Motion Ride out of France. I've just finished doing a review on that fork, so check out the link in the description to check that out. Also, in this review, this bike is a gearbox driven bike. I'm not going to talk about the gearbox in this review because I have another 20-minute review that separates the gearbox and the drivetrain from the actual review of this bike. So after watching this video, I suggest go and check out the gearbox review of the Pinion gearbox. I talk all about what that's like to ride on the trail and how it fits into riding this Zerode Katipo bike. The Zerode Katipo comes in two different color options for the first run of bikes. This one here is called Peppermint Rascal, which is a gloss finish, and it also comes in a Sharknado Grey, which is a semi-matte satin sort of grey finish color. You can see those colors on the website. Now, what are my first impressions of the bike when I took it out of the box? The overall fit and finish of the bike, very nice. It's up there with anything you'll find from the top of the range Yeti or Santa Cruz bikes. Pretty good. So how heavy is the Zerode Katipo? Well, mine weighs in at just over 35 pounds. Certainly not the lightest of the Enduro bike builds I've done, but I've gone with an aggressive style build on this one. It's got downhill tires, coil shock, and a funky fork, so not too bad. Certainly not the lightest, but then again, it's not the heaviest either. And with that gearbox being at the crank area, it certainly doesn't feel heavy when you're riding it on the trail. So now for the all-important geometry numbers. Look at my arm, it looks ridiculous. Now for me, the geometry numbers of a bike are all important. The ones that matter for me are the head angle, 64 degrees on this bike. It has a 25mm BB drop. It has 444mm rear chain stays and is available in 505 or 475mm reach options. So this bike having relatively long reach numbers and being paired with 29-inch wheels, I would say that they're targeting the taller rider, let's say at a guess 5'10" and above. If you're 5'10" or below, then you can probably check out the Zerode Katipo range, which has 27.5 wheels. Now, I will mention one thing that I do hate about this bike, and it's this thing here. The giant seat tube that all extra large frames seem to come with. Now for me, this was almost a deal breaker. Having such a high seat tube, I feel that this is the last sort of remnants of what I would call old school mountain bike geometry. It always seems to happen that if you order an extra large reach size or an extra large frame, that they still come with these horrible tall seat tubes. Now, like I said, for me, this is almost a deal breaker because I come from a downhill and a BMX racing background, which means I'm stood up most of the time. And when I'm attacking steep technical trails, I want my seat to be well out of the way. And this seat tube at 490mm is at the cusp of being too tall for me. Now, I've kind of gotten around it by using this bike yoke dropper post, which has a very, very low stack height, and pairing it with kind of a low stack height seat from SDG. If it was any taller, I wouldn't own this bike. Now, I really do wonder why they've done this, because it's got a straight shot seat tube, so you can slam a long dropper post down right inside this frame. And with companies like OneUp offering a 210mm dropper post, there's really no excuse for having such a tall seat tube. And don't forget, you can always raise your dropper post up a little bit if it's not tall enough when you're riding, but you can't get it any lower. Almost so dark. Here you go. Yeah. Climbing. What's the Zerode Katipo like at going up hills? I'm going to say for a fairly gravity orientated enduro bike that this thing climbs fairly well. It's actually got very good anti-squat suspension kinematics, which I won't get into too much, but if you're kind of seated and grinding your way up like I am now, it goes up great. It does like a little bit of snap if you're sort of stood up trying to accelerate up a hill, but if you sort of pair this Katipo suspension kinematics with a Shox that has a lockout switch, then it's not a bad climber at all. You're never going to win a cross-country race on it, but it's not too bad. It's got a slightly revised seat tube angle over its counterpart, the Zerode Katipo. They've made it about a degree steeper. So this is 75.5 degrees of seat tube angle. I'm going to say they could probably go a touch steeper, but it's definitely an improvement. Riding uphill is bullshit. So for me, on paper, the Zerode Katipo ticks all the boxes as far as geometry goes, but this bike has one huge advantage over all its competition, and that is the lack of cassette and derailleur on the back wheel. And on the trail, this bike is an absolute weapon. Now normally when I compare traditional cassette style bikes with derailleurs to one another, I kind of struggle a little bit to be able to communicate the slight subtleties in suspension performance and the idiosyncrasies that each bike might have, but not with the Zerode Katipo. Now when you point this thing down a rough slope with successive big hits, its composure, its stability, its stiffness, and its ninja-like silence, it literally makes me feel embarrassed for people that own traditional style cassette bikes. Now there is quite a few arguments for not having a cassette and a derailleur on the back of your bike. A lot of people do mention that derailleurs are easily broken off or hit on rocks and things like that, but I raced downhill for a long time and I don't think I broke one derailleur off in the entire time I was racing. Now it can be an issue, but I find that argument is a bit of a non-starter. My main argument for not having a derailleur is obviously the weight of the derailleur and the cassette, and a derailleur is a precision piece of equipment, and unless it is perfectly adjusted, it doesn't work properly. You get that clunking noise when you try and accelerate, and the thing is that this precision piece of equipment hangs off the back of your swing arm, which violently shakes around all the time, and it inherently comes out of adjustment just from aggressive riding. Now derailleurs are also designed to articulate, to tension the chain, and so you can remove the wheel, and combined with that violent shaking of the rear swing arm, these things are crazy noisy. And you might not realize it until you ride a gearbox bike how noisy a derailleur is. If I jump on a bike that has a derailleur, I actually think it has a problem. I keep on stopping to look back every time I go over some big bumps. Now, I also mentioned removing that weight off the rear wheel and putting it in the drivetrain gearbox area. Now that has a massive effect on your suspension's performance. Now something that's worth doing some extra research in if you can be bothered is called sprung versus unsprung mass ratios. Now having less unsprung mass, anything that basically moves with the wheel, so removing any weight from your rear wheel, anything that's moving, greatly increases your suspension's performance and allows your wheel to follow the terrain much more accurately. So it's not just the ability of the rear wheel to be able to follow the ground, which actually translates to having more grip, but your shock doesn't have to work as hard. So the ability to control the damping of the rear wheel is increased, and it actually increases the sensitivity of the clickers when you adjust the low speed, high speed and rebound controls on your rear shock. So any adjustments you make are actually better felt. Now, one other strange added bonus of having less rear wheel weight or less unsprung mass is I haven't had a flat in the 2.5 years that I've owned a Zerode. Not one flat tire. My previous bike was a Santa Cruz Nomad. I only owned that for 12 months and I actually broke 3 Ibis carbon rims. Not one broken rim on the Zerode, not one flat tire. Now, why is that? Because the rear wheel is so much lighter, the suspension is able to get out of the way of those big sharp rocks. If you've got a giant big 50-tooth cassette on the back of your bike, as well as a derailleur, it's got much more inertia and that punches, ouch, it's got much more inertia and that punches through, and that's what creates those flat tires and those broken rims. Bonus. So in my opinion, I actually think Zerode needs to reverse engineer their pitch a little bit. Can you imagine if Gearbox bikes were the only thing that existed and then someone invented a cassette and a derailleur system? What would their pitch be like? Oh, let's remove all of the gears from an internally sealed drivetrain unit that sits right where you need the weight to be, and let's put it on the rear wheel to decrease the suspension's performance, as well as have a precision adjusted piece of equipment hanging off your back wheel that makes noise and constantly flops around. Oh, and by the way, your chain line can't be straight anymore if you want to change gears. You have to let the chain climb up an external cassette. Are you kidding me? Can you imagine how much of a field day the keyboard warriors would have then? Think about it. Whoa. So the Katipo comes in 2 different travel options. A 160mm Enduro model, which is what I'm riding, and a 140mm trail option. Now, make sure you decide on which travel option you want before you buy it, because it's not a very simple swap. Each bike has a specific shock length, and that rocker link that pushes the shock is also different. It is able to be swapped over, but it's not as straightforward as you might first think. So who is this bike best suited to? I'm going to say that this bike is best suited to the enduro racer rider, someone who is happy to grind up the hill if they have to, but also someone who appreciates uncompromised on-trail and descending performance. Now, this bike's trail speed and on-trail performance is on par, if not better, than any of the ultra high-end enduro bikes currently available on the market, and it has a stability that can only be compared to other downhill bikes. Now, if you're a downhiller that is forced to ride enduro because none of your mates shuttle anymore, then this bike is for you. If you hate the noise of a derailleur following you down the hill, then this bike is for you. If you can name a prevalent road cyclist that isn't Lance Armstrong, then you probably didn't get this far in the video. Well, that about wraps it up for me for this Zerode Katipo review. I hope you enjoyed the review. If you've got any questions, please hit me up in the comments down below. I'll always answer you down there. Please check out the review of the Pinion gearbox. I take a deep dive into what that's like to ride. I'll also put a link in the description to the reviews for all of the other products that you can see on my bike, and I'll give you a full product description of the components that I'm using on my bike. Don't forget to like and subscribe and share this with your friends if you had a good time watching this. I hope the review helps, and as always, ride on, guys.